In Joshua chapter 8, to get started this morning, it's been a couple weeks since we've done some of our review for our 17 time periods. We'll get back to that, Lord willing, next week, but there's some information I want to share before we get into our next lesson today in our history and geography class. So as we're all coming in and as we're all settling down, and as we're settling down over here to the right as well, we'll get going and let everybody get settled today. Like I said, if you have your Bibles, open them to Joshua chapter 8. And look with me in verse 30 through verse 35. Joshua chapter 8, verse 30 through verse 35. Now that Becca's not whipping on those kids anymore, it's a little bit quieter over there. I'm just teasing. Joshua chapter 8 and verse 30. At the time Joshua built an altar to the Lord, the God of Israel, on Mount Ebal, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded the people of Israel, as is written in the book of the law of Moses, an altar of uncut stones upon which no man has wielded an iron tool. And they offered on it burnt offerings to the Lord and sacrificed peace offerings. And there was in the presence of the people of Israel, he wrote in stones a copy of the law of Moses, which he had written. And all Israel, sojourner as well as native born, with their elders and officers and their judges, stood on opposite sides of the ark before the Levitical priest, who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord. Notice this in verse 33, half of them in front of Mount Gerizim, and half of them in front of Mount Ebal, just as the servant of Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded at the first to bless the people of Israel. Afterward he read the words of the law, the blessings and the curse, according to all that is written in the book of the law. There was not a word of all that Moses had commanded that Joshua did not read before all the assembly of Israel, and the women and the little ones, and the sojourners who lived among them. So here in Joshua chapter 38, we read about the people passing through Shechem, which is in the middle of Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, which we talked about recently in our history and geography class. It's very small on this map, but where my shaky hand, which I can't control, is pointing, is Mount Ebal. And when they passed through, on one side they had the people who were reading the curse, the other side were reading the blessing. That's talked about in Deuteronomy chapter 27. Now I'm bringing all this up because this past Thursday, there was this small artifact that was announced. It's been discovered for a while, but they've been doing some research on it. This little 2 by 2 centimeter artifact of folded lead was found in a pile of rubble from an altar that was excavated on Mount Ebal back in the 80s, if I'm remembering correctly. And from the Houston Chronicle, as well as you can look up at the Times of Israel, and if you know the guys from Appian Media, they're members of the church who are very into archaeology and history. They've got a YouTube channel and a Facebook page and I think a website as well. I want to read a little bit about this tablet that was found and why I'm bringing it up today in our history and geography class. A tablet containing the words of the ancient Hebrew curse predating the Dead Sea Scrolls. Have we heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls before? We've heard about that in relation to dating the Bible and some authenticity to the biblical text. So this tablet predates the Dead Sea Scrolls, has been uncovered and translated by an archaeologist from Katy. This discovery, announced this past Thursday, could be proof that the Bible is hundreds of years older than scholars previously thought. Dr. Scott Stripling, director of the Archaeological Studies Institute at the Bible Seminary in Katy, led the team. And this tablet reads, "Cursed, cursed, cursed, cursed by the God Yahweh. You will die, cursed, cursed, you will surely die, cursed by Yahweh, cursed, cursed, cursed." Just full of happiness there within that little tablet. It goes on to say the Dead Sea Scrolls are considered the defining artifact that determines the book's age. The scrolls were written about 150 BC. Separately, some historians say that the Bible, including the book of Exodus, which dates the Israelites' flight from Egypt, was written somewhere between 600 BC and 300 BC. So a little bit of pop quiz trivia for a second. About what time would we date the Exodus actually happening in history? Now, that's maybe kind of a loaded question. I don't want to get into the debate of the dating, but about what time might we say the day of the Exodus happened? About 15 BC, 1500 BC. Yeah, I'm just teasing. That's right, 1500 BC. But I don't know if I want to say a majority, but there are some in the realm of biblical scholarship who say the book of Exodus, which records that event, wasn't actually written until 600 BC or 300 BC, somewhere in that time period. You're looking at 1,200 to 900 years later than what the events actually took place. So this tablet is something that's going to, I'll just keep reading the article. The tablet discovered by Stripling's team was written about 1500 BC, which would be proof that the Hebrews were writing in the same stylistic linguistic manners that the Bible was written. We now have the name Yahweh, the biblical God of Israel, and an inscription dating from the late Bronze era, which is earlier than many skeptics would argue that the Bible existed, or that there was even an ability to write down a sacred text, Stripling said. The artifact is at least 200 years older than any other Hebrew text in existence, and 1,350 years older than the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, this is just a touch about some things that are still being discovered that are helping us to understand the timeline of when the Bible was written, the reliability of the Bible, and events that relate to the Bible. I'm not a big archaeological guy. When Jeffrey Wayne O'Rear was 5 years old, he wanted to be a paleontologist, and he was sure he was going to dig up dinosaurs for a living. But I very much veered off that path because as I grew older, I realized, wow, that sounds kind of boring. It's not necessarily a boring job. It's a very cool discovery to see what these people have found and what it could mean for helping us build evidence for the dating of the Bible and the reliability of the Bible. And we're still finding these things out. That's why we're bringing this up today. As an interview with Dr. Stripling talked about with the Appian Media guys, he said, this is really significant in just the fact that we've only really touched the surface for a lot of things relating to biblical archaeology. Even after thousands of years of people digging up sites and looking for things, there's still lots to be found and lots to go through and lots that could be found to help build evidence. And even this fact, particular, again, this small little tablet, I think I stuck it back in my pocket or right here. I mean, this size, you have 40 characters on it, and it could show something that's just this big, that the Bible is much more reliable than what people want it to be, and much more accurate and older than people want it to be as well. So after we just recently talked about Mount Ebal, and since this is a fairly recent discovery or something that was recently announced, I wanted to share it with you all. This is still an ongoing discussion. There still needs to be some peer review. There still needs to be some more image scanning that's done with this particular tablet, and I think some other artifacts found from this area. And as those things are talked about, we can maybe bring up those things some in our class as well. I guess before I move on, the good teacher in me would allow questions or comments. Just know that that's the extent of my knowledge pretty much. And so if you have questions, it's probably going to be, I don't know. Jeff, question or comment?
Archaeologist came to us at college last year, and she was working in Syria and other Bible lands, and her whole presentation was about the logistics of archaeology, how hard it is to get permission from these different governments to go to these places, and she also talked about how funding is a factor.
Mm-hmm.
If they know the grant that they got is really small, they say, oh, well, all we need to know can be learned by a surface study.
Mm-hmm.
But if they know they have a lot of money, they say, we must do an excavation.
Mm-hmm.
So it just depends.
Yeah.
They can find all kinds of things if they have the money.
Right.
A lot of times they don't.
Yeah, I mean, this is usually not just, we at Judson Road are going to go take a field trip to Israel and going to start just digging up in someone's home or someone's property to look for Bible. That's not how these things are going to work, and that's an important reminder. Ms. Rebecca?
I've heard people say, and I think a preacher here, that it was not uncommon for the common people not to be able to read and write. But to find that would be an example of their writing. And then God tells the children of Israel to write these things on your lips. If they didn't know how to read and write, I don't know how they wrote them on their lips.
Right.
So I don't think we make a lot of assumptions about time periods and accept them as truths. But there's a case, I'm convinced they could read and write,
Mm-hmm.
and you need to study if someone tells you something, don't just accept, okay, that could read and write. God treated them as though they could read and write, so I'm pretty sure they could read and write.
Yes. So we often will sometimes say, sometimes, that's a terrible statement. We will sometimes say things to the effect of, people in the New Testament world, when they've received copies of letters, may not necessarily been able to read that. And that might be true, that the level of literacy is not as high as it is in the United States in 2021. That might be possible. But to say that, to maybe take a blending of man's idea of primitive man and what the Bible actually shows as the people of God and as the people of the world, I mean, the Tower of Babel people were speaking language to each other. And I don't think that was just, grunting at people all the time. They were speaking real words, and then their languages were confused. I mean, I don't know how that worked out or what that turned into, but there was a whole bunch of languages that came from that then. And it may have taken time for them to have written language. We'll talk about that a little bit as we get into our lesson today in this class, and a little bit more in our sermon this morning too. But to blend that together to say that people in Moses' day were just like, the cavemen we read about in comics or in TV shows, that's just not true. God spoke with Adam and Eve on day 6, not day 1. He had just made light and darkness on day 1. But on day 6, he is speaking to them, and they are speaking back to him. And as Miss Rebecca pointed out, in places in Numbers, in places in Deuteronomy, Moses writes down things, and there are people who are going to read things then. Now, it may be that not everybody in the whole congregation of Israel and all million-plus people knew how to read, but everybody knew how to listen, and there are definitely people who know how to read and write, as that's going to be continuing to push down or to be passed down through generations.
Moses was told to write as early as Exodus.
Right.
Down this in a book
Mhm.
so that people can remember.
Exactly.
So obviously, they're keeping a record as early as Exodus.
Mhm.
And even Noah must have known how to look at blueprints, know how to look at
Know how to design and
design
build.
and
Right.
build. Whether God gave him that knowledge or he learned it somehow,
These are not the dummies we sometimes
they're not
put them out to be. That's right. Absolutely. So we'll continue to talk about this as more information will develop. We'll want to continue to build our own strength and evidence, like Miss Rebecca said about just because someone tells us something about Bible people, want to do our own research and information. Do your own research and information about this tablet and say, is this legitimate? Before we start just spouting out facts to say, now all atheists are stupid, that may not be the best way to try to build bridges or to have conversations about someone when we're trying to show them reliability of the Bible story, reliability of the biblical text, the reliability that God exists and that they need to submit themselves to him. And so do your own research about those things. Well, that's why I mentioned the Times of Israel, the Houston Chronicle, Appian Media. Go to some of these places and look some of this stuff up on your own if you want a little bit more information than what I can give you right now through this short introduction. Let's get into our lesson for today. We're in our history and geography class. We're spending some more time just talking about some geographical basics and foundations. We've been spending the past few lessons very focused on the small land of Palestine, or Israel, or Canaan, or whatever you want to call it, some of those interchangeable names where the people of God dwelt, where God dwelt with a lot of the people in that area and around, like the Philistines, or the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Edomites, some of those folks as well. We're branching out a little bit more this lesson to talk about the Old Testament lands that we see, and then next lesson we'll branch out to talk more about some other New Testament lands as the world gets a little bit bigger in the biblical story, and we'll do some review next week as well. So as we're talking about the Old Testament lands, if you've got your lesson book, this is lesson number 6 on page 20. If you've got your Bible, you can be opening them to Genesis chapter 15. It looks like we'll do just a couple of verse recommendations or verse references here in just a moment. So as we're thinking about Old Testament lands, the first thing we want to do as we're moving to a new map is compare the differences between maps. So one way we can make sure we understand the difference between the previous map of Palestine, which is not just, it's in a portraitscape as opposed to a landscape, would be to look at the scale of miles. So those highlighted boxes are fairly small up there, but this map over here on the left was a scale of 0 to 40 miles, as opposed to this map on the right, which is 0 to 600 miles. So while the map might be kind of shrunken down, you're looking at a much larger picture of the earth. And if you have your lesson book, you're actually looking at a map that's from 0 to 300 miles, a different scale as well. If you're looking in your own Bible in the back, you might look and just say, okay, how big is this map? Am I looking at a scale that's, from 0 to 400 miles, 0 to 10 miles, to get an idea about what type of landscape are we looking at here. So when reviewing and studying maps, we want to make sure we understand the scale of miles to get the proper perspective of how small or large an area really is. Our first area we want to focus on this morning in Old Testament lands is what we know as the land of Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is this highlighted area over here with the circle around it. And here in this section, we're looking at categories of some rivers like the Euphrates, like the Tigris, like some of just the very edge of the Persian Gulf. Let's talk about some of the features and people from this particular area in Mesopotamia. So the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers are some of the main bodies of water within this particular area. They flow southeast into the Persian Gulf. The Tigris is a swift river, is over 1,100 miles long. That's to the northern river out of the two here. So this bottom river is the Euphrates. The top river is the Tigris. The Euphrates River is a little bit longer, about 1,700 miles. And I ask you to turn to Genesis chapter 15 and verse 18. Genesis 15, verse 18. We may not always see it referred to as the Euphrates River, but in Genesis chapter 15 and verse 18, God makes a covenant with Abraham and says to him, "To your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river." And here it does qualify or say this is the river Euphrates, but sometimes it's just going to be the great river, or simply called the river in the Old Testament. Now, within this particular area, you might remember if you go back to Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2, within somewhere around this particular area, based on the maps that we have today and the knowledge that we have today of this area, is an approximation of where the Garden of Eden would have been. Now, this is Jeff O'Rear's opinion and understanding. With something like a worldwide flood, or something especially with the fact of God placing a cherubim there, or a guardian there, a flaming sword at the entrance of Eden, I don't think no matter how hard we try, we're going to find the Garden of Eden. Whether it's been destroyed, which some people think that's not really possible, whether it's just not able to access, it's based on the descriptions, maybe somewhere within this area. But for our studies and our purposes of the Old Testament, especially as we move forward, we just really want to know this area as the Euphrates River and understanding as being a part of the Mesopotamian area.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
I've always thought that the Garden of Eden was in that area.
Mm-hmm.
Also, Genesis 2 and verse 14, where it says, "And the name of the third river is the Tigris, which flows east of Assyria, and the fourth is the Euphrates."
Right.
So it's even mentioned there in the scripture. Both of those are even mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And, I do think that it was there somewhere.
Right. Somewhere in that area. We've got two other rivers that we just don't know where those rivers are. I mean, even when we look at our maps, there's nothing listed there. But there does seem to be evidence that it was somewhere within that particular area.
And the Tigris was mentioned as well.
Mm-hmm. That's right. It's not just Euphrates, it's both of them that are mentioned there. So there is some pretty good evidence, pushing in that direction. Mesopotamia is a word that means between the rivers. So when we talk about the people of Mesopotamia, we're not talking about a nation of people. We're talking about a geographic term. We're talking about people from Mesopotamia would be people who live in this area. This is a term for this place rather than a term of people. So rather than being the Edomites, who are from Edom, this is the Mesopotamia area. People who are Mesopotamian could be Babylonian or Assyrian or any other type of nation that's around here, people who dwell within this area. We'll talk about some in just a second. So this term, it refers to all the area reaching from the Persian Gulf to the Ararat Mountains, which I think we're going to get to in just a moment here. Moving forward a little bit, I'm going to try to not go too fast. If I'm moving too quick, flag me down. So if you want to slow down and look at some of these things. But this area, the Assyrian and Babylonian empires are going to originate from here, which, you've got lots of river water supply. You've got a very lush green area. Now, that's probably green more because of the way this map has been colored, but even with the rivers there, you would have some good areas for farming or for finding food or finding material that you need to survive. So it makes sense that you'd have some strong empires from there. The villages within there grew into cities over the times, and these cities were able to control their neighbors. So rather than having maybe a state or a country, you have a whole bunch of these cities that seem to kind of rise up. You have the city-state feature. Maybe you remember that from world history or from some of your history in high school or college or even from biblical studies. So you have cities like Babylon or cities like Rome or cities like Nineveh that grow into some of these empires that start off kind of by just showing dominance or conquering some of the surrounding cities there as well.
I remember I taught some of this when I taught you world history, and that it's an area where there's no natural boundaries and borders. Like, in Egypt, you've got the desert, and you've got the ocean there's no natural boundaries, which means anybody can come in there, and there would be civilizations after civilizations. It wouldn't be a long term before another group came in. And I thought that was interesting. And it's also present day Iraq. So
Right.
a lot of people in the Iraq war, a lot of things were happening. We're right there on those rivers and so forth. And, it has made recent history. And the other thing I remember was that the floods were often violent and not regular. Like the Nile would flood at a regular basis.
Right.
It created a great farmland, and the floods of these rivers were sometimes violent and cruel and killed thousands of people. And the person I was reading that had a commentary about it said that was, in their opinion, why their gods were mean and violent people, or not people, but gods,
Right.
and deity and so forth. Anyway, it's an interesting area from those perspectives as well.
Absolutely. So something that a class like this will do is we'll provide some foundation of, I'm going to give a very sweeping, very broad picture of this Bible land within one lesson. But there's a lot of history of people and nations and topography and geography you could dig into more. You could probably start by looking at Tracy. Sounds like he's got a little bit more information than I do about this. You could talk about some of the things or look up some of these people on your own. I know Wikipedia isn't like a citable source for a college paper, but boy, Wikipedia is helpful for just getting started with things. So you could do some of that research on your own to help understand a little bit more of these areas. That's a great point about there's not really boundaries of things that you see like Egypt. We'll get to Egypt in a second. And Egypt very much is Egyptian for a long time. But here you have empires that are constantly moving in and out. You have, even think about within the latter part of the Old Testament, you go from the Syrians to the Assyrians to the Babylonians to the Medo-Persians to the Greeks to the Romans, all within a period of about 1,000 years, which, is a long time, a lot longer than any of us are going to live. But, that's pretty quick succession for some of those empires to rise and fall compared to Egypt or some other older dynasties even outside of biblical description. Think about places in Asia or other places like that. We'll continue to move along, talk about some of the things about Mesopotamia. The points are made about some, we'll call them technology within this area. Early irrigation systems, the wheel is invented. There are metals that are used to make tools. They're beginning to use a mathematical system that we use still today. There's what's known as the Cuneiform Riding. So you would take clay or some type of tablet and you would make some ingrains or some impressions in them to be able to have some type of written system. Again, these people were not just Neanderthals who, had no type of way of communicating with each other, but they had a way to say, okay, this little dash, if it's at this degree, is going to mean this idea. And I can communicate either numbers or letters to you so you can understand what I'm saying to you. So I can pass a law to say that I rule over you, or we can try to make some type of agreement together. This is a picture of an example of cuneiform writing from Mesopotamia here on your right. And then on your left, kind of another major language at this time, which is more pictorial rather than syllabic, I think is the way that you would use that in linguistic terms. It's hieroglyphics. We're probably all familiar with hearing about Egyptian hieroglyphics. A picture of something, this picture stands for river, or this picture stands for boat, or this picture is for man. And if you put the picture of man and boat together, you're talking about pirate. I don't know, I made that up. So that may not be exactly what the Egyptians were saying, but you could use these pictures then to tell stories or communicate information in some way. That's what they were doing in this day and time, to communicate information like this. Speaking of some of the mountains within this area, the Zagros Mountains run parallel to the north of the Tigris River. They're about 9,000 feet high. You'd be able to trade with one another within that area. The descendants of Noah, son Japheth, the Medes are going to develop over here within this area. So in Genesis chapter 9, Genesis chapter 10, Genesis chapter 11, when you get some of those informations about Noah's sons, all three of Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, but by the end of those chapters, you're really just focusing on one particular family, with occasionally other people coming about. So some people go to the west, and so when they go to the west, they move that direction. Think about maybe from where Noah landed. They move that way, and we never really hear about them again. Some people are going to go maybe more into the Euro-Asian area. Some people are going to stay more within this particular area of Mesopotamia. So we have some of those information about where some of Noah's sons settled. The Ararat Mountains, which we're probably a little bit more familiar with. While we think about the Ararat Mountains, or particularly Mount Ararat, what's our connection there with that? The ark, where Noah's ark was landed or was placed after the end of the flood. I know that there's all types of questions about that. We talk about archaeology and trying to get to find a location for some of that. I think people have been doing that for years. What's modern-day Turkey, right? But it's been very difficult. You can't just walk up and go up a mountain on your own. Number one, you have to climb a mountain. You'd have to take gear and all that with you, and you have to have the local ability and permission for you to do that. Now, people have tried. I think we've had conversations in this class before when Sam was talking about Mount Ararat and Mr. Charles was bringing up some of those things, and I'm sure people will still try to do that. Will we ever find it? I don't know. In our material, it very clearly says no one knows the exact spot where Noah stepped out of the ark, although tradition marks particular twin-peaked mountains. So we have an idea. We know exactly where it happened, but somewhere within this mountain range is where the ark would have landed. Very high range, mountains that were 20,000 feet above sea level. And so if I knew I was going to do that, Moses' ark. If Noah's ark was going to land on Mount Ararat, you'd have to have a lot of water to get 20,000 feet up in the air. And so we'll get more into the flood at a later time, but seems to be some pretty good evidence for a very large worldwide kind of flood with lots of water. Again, Noah's ark rested here. Let's move a little bit west from Mesopotamia then into the Arabian Desert. The section that's southwest of the land of Mesopotamia, southwest of the Euphrates, covers approximately 1 million square miles, extends into the extension of the Sahara Desert. So the Sahara Desert's in the northern part of Africa. This is actually an extension of that desert to a degree, but really we're focused on just this one part of the Arabian Desert, really that one part of the Saharan Desert. This would have been made up of a lot of tribesmen and traders within that area. Saudi Arabia, I understand, would still be in this area today, right? There's going to be some oil there that people are going to find now. But they're going to make their way by living off of the trade routes or doing a lot of trade within that area. I mean, if you live in a desert, you're probably not going to be doing a lot of just hunkering down and staying there. You're going to do some shepherding type of things where you're going to move around to find grass to take care of your flocks, or you're going to do lots of trading in order to make a living or to have possessions or goods. Tracy?
That stuck with me, the trade routes. It connects 3 continents, Africa, Europe, and Asia, on those roads that were often traveled with the traders right through that region.
Exactly.
Remember that too.
Yep, that's right. So you get a lot of traffic of people who are moving from one place to the next, which is not just great for goods, but again, we're in a Bible class. That's great for the gospel and great for knowledge of God, because then as some of those people are going to move to Mesopotamia to trade or to do work, some of them are going to talk about their God that they worship, and that's going to be crazy to them. But the greatness of God is going to be proclaimed to the nations around Israel and to other places, and especially once we move into the New Testament with the Gospels. I mean, think about how because of those trade routes and because of that world and how that world was connected through the land of Palestine, that Paul was able to so easily travel around. I mean, he wasn't just calling an Uber. He wasn't just hopping on Southwest and going to all these places really easy and convenient, but he had ways to get to these places because of some of these accessible trade routes and things like that. This area in the desert is not just one vast sand dune, as is described, but you have people who live there known as the Amorites. The point is made in the material as well that there's huge lava beds that are immediately east of the northeast of the land of Canaan, beds larger than Canaan itself. So those darker brown areas upon that, you can see right to the left of that dark brown area is the Salt Sea. You get a little bit of green that would be Canaan or Palestine, but there in the desert you've got these huge lava beds that are bigger than Canaan itself. So it's not just like the movie Dune that just came out, or Tatooine from Star Wars of just the one big sandscape, but it seems like there's a little bit of differences even within the geography.
I had a thought, and I could be just crazy, but this business about these huge volcanoes creating all of that lava, maybe the 2 rivers that disappear that we don't know about, maybe their sources were destroyed in these volcanic eruptions.
Maybe.
Because
Mhm.
if they still existed, they could have been, like south of the Euphrates, which is about where the sources could have been.
Right.
So, I mean, they're not there.
Mhm.
They were. They're not anymore.
Yeah. At one point, those rivers were there. And it could be, like Jeff is saying, that that's a connection to, those lava beds or those volcanic areas. Could be like that. There's a lot of, when it gets to especially pre-Genesis 12, there's going to be a lot of, there's a lot of maybe some evidence for that and a possible idea. We may just never know with 100% certainty for those things. Give me just a second to get my iPad reconnected. We can keep going. Let's move from Mesopotamia and the Arabian Desert now to Egypt. What are some of our big Egypt stories in the Bible? Moses, that's one. Let's think of some even beyond Moses, though. Who are some other some other Egypt-related stories? Jesus went there in Matthew 2, right? Matthew 1, something like that. Who else has been to Egypt before? Joseph's been there before. Joseph's great-grandfather, Abraham, right? There's that. You got other times that the land of Egypt is mentioned as being involved, maybe some conflict with Babylon. And who's right between Egypt and Babylon when those two empires are wanting to fight and clash with one another? Israel is. They're right there caught in the thick of that. And so when Judah or Israel is sometimes either choosing sides or trying to do things of their own accord, even in the book of Jeremiah, the people after Babylon comes and takes most of the people into captivity to Babylon, people try to go to Egypt and do things on their own in Egypt. That does not go well for them. So Egypt is a place that we find often in Scripture. Miss Rebecca? You're just going to backtrack a little bit. To where? The tar pits, the lava pits?
If you go to Genesis chapter 14, I couldn't remember exactly where it was, that's why I didn't talking about Abraham when he goes in and rescues Lot, who's been captured by the king of Sodom. Starting in verse 19, it says, "Now the valley of Siddim was full of bitumen," which would be tar pits, "and as the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some fell into them, and the rest fled into the hill country." So they were actually trapped in those tar pits.
Mm-hmm.
And if you go above that, it refers to the Amalekites. So here we're studying things that we think are extraneous to the Bible, but the Bible spells them out specifically.
What chapter were you in there?
Said about 14.
And what verse was that?
Well, it talks about the Amalekites in verse 7 and 8, and then if you go down to verse, I've got a new Bible, I can only see. Verse 10.
Okay, so Genesis 14:10. This is the English Standard Version. "The valley of Siddim was full of bitumen pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled and fell into them, the rest of the hill country." Now, I don't know what the word bitumen means, and you have to use my dictionary, but it'd be like tar, some type of lava pit as well. So again, we want to do those things. Feel free at times to stop me and say, hey, here's a connection to a Bible passage where that takes place. Last week when we did our review of our those previous 3 lessons, we wanted to also mention that we've got a sheet up here, and I can send this to you if you would like, that says, hey, you want to have something about the Salt Sea? Here's where the Bible mentions the Dead Sea or the Salt Sea, just briefly. I mean, it doesn't come up a whole lot in the Bible story, but it's there. Or here's something about those tar pits or those lava pits that are mentioned here within the Bible story. And so we can see that these things are not just, it's just because it's the land there, but it's because that these are also things that connect to the story of the Bible itself.
Jeff,
Tracy, real quick.
bitumen pits are tar pits, sometimes referred to as asphalt pits, are large asphalt deposits. They form in the presence of oil, which is created when decayed organic matter is subjected to pressure underground. And anyway.
Well, Tracy just knew that off the top of his head like that. So.
Google.
Google, that's right. Google is an amazing things many times. Let's move into talking about Egypt. We've just mentioned some of our places of Egypt. Emerged during the same time as the Sumerians were in Mesopotamia. Again, hieroglyphics were used about the same time as their cuneiform writings, that picture kind of writing, but there's no connection between the two. Ancient Egypt consisted of just the river valley. So when you think of Egypt today, you look at Egypt on a map, it's this weird parallelogram. Is that the geometry term? It's not quite a rectangle, but it's got a little bit of a curve to it in some way. But really, Egypt and ancient Egypt would have just been basically anything that would fall right around the Nile River. 99% of the people lived on 4% of the land here, and it's very much dependent upon the life of the Nile. So let's focus on the Nile for a little bit. The river is 1 to 24 miles wide, depending on where you are. 115 miles wide at the widest point, and 125 miles long. So there at the top, what we call the delta, that very wide point, you have all these points where the river branches out and leading into the Mediterranean Sea. You'd have lots of life, lots of culture, lots of people who would kind of dwell within that particular area. This is the longest river in the world. I'm sure maybe you know that from Jeopardy or Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader? I think I remember that being a question on there. You just remember that from some of your information. You know these things about it's a long river, but it's very much dependent, or the people are very much dependent upon it. I want to read this from the notes on page 25 within our workbook. The plague of water to blood was a direct blow to the god of the Nile River. The plague of thunder and hail would have been doubly starting to a land of rare rains. I think we're going to get into that in just a moment, about how there's very little rain that happens within Egypt. I mean, you're looking at within the area of the delta, about 8 inches per year. And the southern part of Egypt is actually known as Upper Egypt, gets no rain a year. Anybody know how much rain Longview gets a year approximately?
50 inches?
About 50. The thing I saw was 48.6, so we'll round that up to 50. I mean, you're talking, what is that, 6 times as much rain as what Egypt gets in that particular area, at least based on this information. But people thrive there because of the river, and the river is so important. So when God brings rain and thunder and hail, that's very startling to people who aren't used to rain like that. When God attacks the river or curses the river, turning it to blood, that's very much a big deal for people who rely on that river so much for all of its water and a lot of its life and a lot of its resources. More things about the Egyptians. They built pyramids. We're probably familiar with that. These pyramids were built even before God called Abram from Ur, the Chaldeans. They were first to set up a 365-day calendar divided into, I think, equal 12 months with an extra 5 feast holidays, they called it. And they had lots of medical skills. They were able to perform operations of some kinds even. The Great Sea leads into the north, or the river flows north as opposed to many rivers that are going to flow south, leading into the Mediterranean Sea. Like Tracy mentioned earlier, the government is united. You don't really have many other nations within this area that are kind of moving in and out. Egypt is able to kind of lock itself in to be Egypt and doesn't fit a whole lot of conflict of nations or people
Never got conquered.
around
Never
them.
hardly conquered it.
That's right.
Alexander.
Yeah, until you get to some of those later ends of the BC areas where the Greeks or maybe a little bit of Babylon's trying to push in, but not quite the way that Alexander or the Romans are going to. That's right. So it stood for a long time, even without walled cities or standing armies. You know, in the land of Mesopotamia, Babylon, Nineveh are known as these very tall, walled, thick, fortified kind of cities, maybe similar to, or even probably more so, than the cities in the land of Canaan that we read about when the people were getting ready to go in and conquer the land. But in Egypt, you don't really have to worry about the threat of outsiders, so it seems like they didn't have these high fortified cities. It's just them living with more of an open government, open type of country.
So,
Go ahead.
Some things I remember about it, there were rapids and waterfalls that protected an invading force couldn't sail down the Nile to attack. And then you had the deserts on both sides, and then you had the ocean on one side. And so the natural defenses were included. Even the Nile helped protect Egypt.
I'm listening to you. I'm trying to remember within the notes. There's somewhere that talks about that. The Nile is very, it has an easy place to travel in some ways as far as if you want to go to the ocean, you just follow the current. If you want to go south, you just follow the wind. But you have to know that area in order to really, I think, traverse that well.
That's at the bottom of page 20.
Thank you. Continue to think about Egypt. One of our big bodies of water related to Egypt is the Red Sea. What's a Red Sea story you can think of? Crossing the Red Sea. That's not meant to be a trick question there. We probably all remember that from the book of Exodus. The two arms of the Red Sea, you have the Gulf of the Suez, the Gulf of the Aqaba. We're probably familiar with the Suez Canal that leads from here at the top of the Gulf all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. Would not have been there in the days of the Bible, but is there now. That triangular-shaped area in between the two, what would we call this? It's up on the screen, but you probably know some of this area. The wilderness of Sinai is listed there. And so what mountain would be in this area? Mount Sinai would be somewhere in here. If you have a Bible map of the Egyptian flight of the Exodus in the back of your Bible. People have guesses for where Mount Sinai is. I think most people, and that's a very generic term, most people are going to put it more kind of at the bottom of the peninsula. Some people might have it a little bit higher up, closer to Canaan, but somewhere within the Sinai Peninsula you have, or this wilderness area, you have the Mount Sinai. We've moved very quickly here to the end, this area known as the Fertile Crescent. Maybe you're familiar with that term. So this is where the entire Old Testament history takes place, within this green area. With probably you could extend it down into Egypt some as well. But for the most part, I mean, where does Abraham come from? Abraham's going to find himself living in Canaan, but where's Abraham from originally? Which is somewhere, of the Chaldeans, right? Somewhere over in this area, closer to where the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers are. And eventually he moves up to Hebron, I think I'm remembering correctly, and then down into Canaan when he goes into Egypt some, back up into here. His descendants hang out in that area. There's lots of times in the Old Testament that you have other people who are mentioned, but you don't have like, okay, here's all these Bible characters, and then here's Rick from Seattle, right? I mean, we're not including those areas. Our main focus for the Old Testament is all within this particular area. And notice, while it looks like a big area, especially compared to, we've been spending the last few weeks focusing just on this little section of Canaan, Canaan's fairly small compared to the rest of the Old Testament world. But even this is only about 1/3 of the land area of the continental United States. I mean, you're not including Alaska or Hawaii in that, but this is still only about 1/3 of the United States itself. It's about 1,000 miles from Egypt to the northern tip of the Persian Gulf. It's about 1,000 miles from Egypt to the mountains of Ararat. So from somewhere around here to the Ararat Mountains, and somewhere from there to the tip of the Persian Gulf, about 1,000 miles as well. So that's a big area compared to the couple hundred square miles or a couple thousand square miles of this area, but still a fairly small section we're dealing with when we think about the Old Testament lands as a whole. I flew through lots of stuff today, and I want to give one more chance. Any final comments or questions about Old Testament lands before we conclude this morning? Jeff?
This, on page 24, about Arabia being a barren steppe that can only support nomadic Bedouins. I mean, I guess we're kind of familiar with what Bedouins are.
Mm-hmm.
They have flocks, and they travel in pastures. Well, if most of the people Abraham was raised around were living in cities and were farming, he adopted a totally different lifestyle by being a herdsman and moving all those places. I mean, having seen so much of the world, he would be much less of a Chaldean and much more open to becoming a new nation.
That's a very good point. Any other final comments or questions before we close this morning? Next week, lesson 7, we're going to be doing a lot of similar stuff here, but moving into the New Testament lands. So some of this stuff, same area, but really, where are we going to be heading from this particular map? What direction are we going to be expanding towards? So more over towards Rome. It's not on our map here, but we're going to getting more into this. I mean, here you've got some of Asia. You've got the Macedonia, Greece. You've got Rome, more this direction as well. Look over some of those areas in your own map. Continue to work on those things. Continue to follow these lessons. Continue to build on some of these foundations so as we get into the Bible story itself, this helps us to understand this a little bit more. Thank you for your comments, for your participation today. If you want a map of Old Testament lands, I've got just a few up here, but if you would like one to be able to work on your own, feel free to come up and grab one. Or if you raise your hand quickly after class, I can get it to you as well. But that'll conclude our class for this morning. Thank you.